Hello, it's Steve Smith again here, and welcome to this third CPD presentation. And it's another one on the topic of listening, this time with a focus on lexical retrieval, that's vocabulary, and parsing, that's grammar. Quick reminder there, that's my blog, FrenchTeacherNet.blogspot.com, and InformedLanguageTeacher.com is a site where I put together links with videos, readings, and podcasts about all sorts of aspects of language learning and language teaching. So here we go. Just a quick reminder from the last couple of recordings that when we talk about listening, the researchers refer to two types of listening: top-down listening and bottom-up listening. So that top-down listening, if you saw my first video then, is where we use background knowledge and context to work out the meaning of something. And bottom-up listening is about deciphering the message. In other words, using the bits of the language code from the level of phonology, vocabulary, grammar, and using that code to build up meaning. And here's a reminder of the John Field model of process listening, where on the left here we've got the different micro skills: phonemic, syllable, word, syntax, intonation, group level. And the point I was trying to get across in the first two presentations was that if we can design activities that focus on each of these micro skills, perhaps we can build up the process of listening and produce more confident listeners. So I'm not going to go through that one again. I assume that you might have seen that already. In the last session, we talked about the importance of phonological memory within the working memory model, and here we've got a sort of a summary here, if I can take you through this. So when we learn vocabulary, it's stored in an oral form, i.e. the sound of words are stored in the phonological loop of working memory, and hopefully then they can pass gradually into our long-term memory, which is where we need them. So we need a good oral representation of words. In other words, we need to be able to imagine how they're pronounced or be able to pronounce them well in order to spot these words in the sound stream. And that's therefore the case for doing reading aloud activities, lots of repetition, anything that builds up accuracy of perception of sound and pronunciation of words. So that could be choral reading aloud, for example, individual reading aloud, paired reading, reading aloud games, and it's also a good case for teaching vocabulary through an oral medium in chunked form. We'll talk more about chunking in a later session, but certainly the message here is don't rely on students knowing words from word lists or simply from the spelling of words or even the meaning of words. They need to have that oral representation of words. And ultimately, the more target language you're using in the lesson, as long as it's comprehensible, the more likely you are to get good listeners. Now, because the focus in this talk is about vocabulary knowledge and retrieving lexis, I just wanted to show you this. Now, Paul Nation there, you can see on the right, is one of the leading experts on vocabulary acquisition. And I'll give you the reference to his book at the end of the presentation. But he talks about what does it mean to know a word. Now, I've already suggested to you that knowing a word is not just knowing its meaning, it's not just knowing how it's spelt, it's a whole number of things. And Paul Nation lists them here in this table, which I've adapted from his book. So yeah, we need spelling, we need to know the pronunciation. We also need to know stuff like the morphological aspects of a word. So for example, if you took a word like play, we need to know that it relates to words like playing, player, players, played, and so on. So in other words, a word is part of a word family, and if we know more about that word family, that helps us with recognizing words in the sound stream. We need the meaning. We need the role of the context the word's in to define its meaning. It's useful to know synonyms and antonyms of words so we can develop these connections in the brain and develop a sort of deeper processing of vocabulary. We need to know when words are used. We need to know about collocations. Now, if you don't know the word collocations, that's to do with how words combine together with other words. So what words tend to go together. So, for example, if you put in your Google search one word at the top, it then produces other words that tend to go with it. So, you think of a word, there are words that go together. That helps with building vocabulary knowledge. So, knowing a word is actually quite a complicated thing. It's important to know this, though, if we look at how we can develop lexical retrieval while listening. So this is therefore a reminder, I guess, to say that if we pick up vocabulary through listening, then it builds phonological memory. To review what I said earlier, we know that knowing a word is partly about knowing what it sounds like, and that learning words and phrases through listening might be better than reading if the aim is to recall words when listening. But bear in mind, when you read silently, you are actually reading out loud in your head, as it were. The technical term is subvocalizing. You're actually imagining those sounds, and interestingly in the research they say that when you imagine words pronounced in your head, that's kind of almost as good as actually saying them out loud or hearing them for real in terms of building long-term memory. And I'm going to make the case also for presenting words in chunks, in utterances, because if part of knowing a word is knowing the company it keeps, then why not take advantage of that and try to avoid, where possible, showing words in isolation. So again, I'm going to dip into one or two exercises from our book, Breaking the Sound Barrier, Teaching Language Learners How to Listen. And so here the focus is on lexical retrieval. So these very simple, often low preparation exercises that you can throw into a lesson as a filler or a starter. As I said in my last video, I wouldn't propose doing lots of these in one lesson, but they can form part of a sequence. So in this one called Odd One Out, then you simply read aloud 4 sentences and students pick the odd one out. Now here, they're very manageable, comprehensible sentences. We would assume that the pupils know the vocabulary already, so the input is comprehensible. But here, the focus is not so much on phonics and phonology, it's about vocabulary, if you think about it, isn't it? Because in this case, the idea is that you pick out, let's say, number 3, snowboarding, because you focused on that word, snowboarding, as opposed to the idea of beach, sunbathing, or swimming. So a dead, simple sort of activity where pupils get listening in small little bites and get to focus on the micro skill of lexical retrieval. This is one called Listen and Colour In. So for this one, you give students an image or a line drawing, for example, of a room. It could be something else, with a good range of items. In the example you'll see in the next slide, it's actually a room. And by the way, I did discover fairly recently that if you use format in Word, you can remove colour from pictures. I should have known that already, but anyway. And so if you get the right sort of pictures, you can do that. And in this case, as you'll see in the next slide, then it's a question of simply describing the room. So in this case, with a class of beginners, and let's assume they've already learnt some prepositions: on, under, next to, beside, and they've also learnt the sort of vocabulary that they would typically learn. What's in my room, what's in my bedroom, and so on. So as the teacher here, you'd simply deliver a description and build in some repetition, some pausing, keep an eye on the class to make sure that they're following you carefully, and they'd have their coloured pencils out and colour in. So who says that colouring in can't be a useful lesson activity? So I would say, for example, the computer is on the table. The computer is grey. There is a football in front of the desk, and the football is black and yellow. Yep, it's a black and yellow football, and it's near the computer table. In front of the computer table, there's a racket. I think it's a tennis racket, and that tennis racket is red. Yes. There's a red tennis racket in front of the table. You've got the idea. So actually you're providing quite a lengthy piece of manageable, comprehensible listening, staying in the target language, and allowing students to build their lexical retrieval skills. In this one, musical chairs, have a look at the description there. This time, you kind of focus on a semantic field, so it might be adjectives or it might be animals or something like that. And if you actually did this as musical chairs, which could be somewhat chaotic, then students would be moving around the classroom. And when they hear in your narrative description a word corresponding to the category, for example, animals, they have to sit down and there aren't enough chairs. Now, if that just sounds way too chaotic for you, then you could do this as sort of a stand-up, sit-down exercise where they stay in their places. You read a description, and when they hear the animal, they sit down. So it's quite a nice, easy, sort of low-prep activity. You could almost make these up on the spot, or if you want to be more careful, then you'd write them out in advance. Now, that focus was on lexical retrieval. I did mention that we'd focus also on parsing, because we do need grammar to make sense of sentences quite clearly. One obvious example is tense. So being able to spot the tense of a verb is crucial for meaning. And another one is the one you can see on the slide in front of you, and that's the idea of active and passive. So, for example, if you had two sentences, the teacher observed the lesson was observed by the teacher. Normally, we expect the pattern subject, verb, object, and normally it's the subject, which is the doer of the activity. And therefore, when students hear something in the second language, they might be expecting that pattern. But of course, in the second case, the doer of the activity is the teacher. So unless students can process the passive here, they might not get the meaning. In fact, they could very easily get the wrong meaning. So that tells us that listening is clearly tied up with grammatical knowledge, and also that listening is tied up with other sorts of lesson activity. So the better your students' grammatical proficiency is, the better they will be at listening. Having said that, as I pointed out in a previous presentation, I think, or I'm going to anyway in a future presentation, vocabulary is more important than grammar. Vocabulary is a great predictor of language ability generally, and although grammar is useful, it's knowing words that's the most useful. So the principle here is that parsing for grammar is important. So this one, a sort of activity you might do with a sort of intermediate level group then. So in this case, if you were focusing on the structure after doing something, or for example in French, après avoir joué, whatever it might be. And you begin a short narrative and then leave gaps. You might model this first so that the students know what they're doing. Then simply start to read to them, and then after the gap they have to supply the right grammatical form. I mean, you could, I suppose, even give them a displayed version, an English version, and then translate, and they've got to put in the right form. So what you see on the screen could be what they see on the board. I mean, this is very, very adaptable, and even with beginners, you can simply leave gaps in short sentences for students to get the right form of a verb. So, think of your own examples of how to do that, but that's the example of getting students to focus on grammar through listening. Now, this one's certainly very popular in England at the moment, and it's one we featured in our book called Delayed Dictation. And in case you don't know what it's about, clearly transcription or dictation is a useful activity for phonics and phonology, but also for lexical retrieval, for grammar, and for spelling generally. But the classic way to do dictation is that you read a phrase and then students write it down straight away. But this is just a variation. If when you dictate with some well-practiced comprehensible input, That's worth mentioning because dictation, if it goes wrong, it's when the language is too hard and students can't handle it. So make sure it's very doable language. Now, instead of them writing down straight away, you simply give them a 10-second delay where they have to hold the phrase inside their heads. You could even distract them during that period. Some students seem to like doing that, and then they write down the phrase on paper or on their mini whiteboards. Now, what's going on there, of course, is that students are rehearsing the language repeatedly in their heads. And in the literature on cognitive psychology, this is referred to as rehearsal. In other words, you get some input, you hold it in working memory, and unless you rehearse it repeatedly, you tend to forget it very quickly. I'll give you an example of this, practical one. If I'm doing a recipe in the kitchen, for example, have you had this sort of experience? You look at the recipe instructions, you go over to your chopping board, you start to do a job, and then you realize you forgot what the next steps were. You go back to your recipe, have another look, and then you try again. And you keep having to go back, don't you? That's because your working memory has difficulty holding information in it short term. It can only hold a very limited amount of information. However, if you were to rehearse in your head repeatedly, and you may have done this, you've then got a chance of remembering it. So any rehearsal has a chance of building long-term memory. And of course, that's what we want students to have. You can do the same with delayed copying, where you put a sentence on the board and then remove it. Students then have to copy it, say 10 seconds later. So a bit more reading on lexical retrieval and this sort of stuff. We've got John Field's book I've mentioned to you before, his classic book, Listening in the Languages Classroom. I mentioned Paul Nation, another classic book from second language acquisition literature, that's Learning Vocabulary in Another Language. And also given you a reference there to a nice open access article about vocab from Paul Nation. And I haven't mentioned this one to you yet, but check out the OASIS database. That's based at the University of York in England. And that's a database of short sort of one-page summaries of research papers. So if you want to develop your interest in research, then I would recommend OASIS. And of course my own site, Informed Language Teacher, which has the same sort of aim, which is to help you get informed about research, if that's your cup of tea. So, thank you very much for listening. That's all for this session. Bye.